Hi everybody, it's Dr. Hall. We're going to shift gears now, going into Unit 7, which is communicable diseases. This is the first of two parts. So just to remind you, communicable diseases are things that are infectious or contagious. They are caused by germs. They can be transmitted from one person to another. And this is just an outline of what we're going to talk about in this unit. This first part is going to focus on these general concepts of burden, routes of transmission, identifying the contributory cause, and the potential impact of any one communicable disease. And then part 2, we're going to talk about tools and strategy. So first, we're going to talk about the burden and what are the ways that we kind of ascertain how important or prevalent or what degree of problem these conditions are causing. So we've looked at this data before, and so we'll just come back to it again because I love these visualizations. Let me get my highlighter here. So in terms of causes of death, this is globally, right? So here are our infectious or communicable diseases over here. A sizable chunk, right? The vast majority are those non-communicable diseases that we talked about last unit. But if we look at disability-adjusted life years, so in terms of the suffering that they cause or the premature deaths that they cause, we see it's a bit bigger chunk. So this is a really significant piece of the health and wellness of a population is the burden of communicable diseases. And if we look at countries that have a low social developmental index, so countries that tend to be poorer or have fewer resources, less infrastructure, fewer systems in place for public health and medical care, we see a huge impact of communicable diseases in disability-adjusted life years. So this is huge in many, many parts of the world. So if we look at lower to middle income countries, so that's what we're looking at here. So let me show you a couple of things about this. So first is that the open circles tell us the year 2000, and the filled in circles are the year 2019. So that's the first thing I want to orient you to. The second thing is that blue are non-communicable diseases, things like ischemic heart disease, which is atherosclerosis, and stroke, which is atherosclerosis in the brain, and then communicable diseases, which is what we're talking about with this unit. And then they've also included injuries. So we can see that in lower to middle income countries, still we see those non-communicable diseases of heart disease and stroke as the big two, but then we see neonatal conditions. These are communicable diseases. These are infections in infants. Okay, so these are infections in newborns. Then number 4 is lung disease from smoking. But then number 5 is lower respiratory infections or pneumonias. And this was before COVID, right? This is going. And diarrheal diseases are actually huge causes of death in many countries in the world, as is tuberculosis, which is something that we see very little of in most parts of the United States. All right, so these are really important. And if we look at the lowest income countries, we're going to see that the leading causes of death, 1 and 2, are infections. So those perinatal, neonatal, newborn infections that happen, and then pneumonias. And then diarrheal diseases, malaria makes the list, tuberculosis, and HIV and AIDS. So we can see that these are very important in many regions of the world. But you can also see another thing here, which is pretty cool, which is that we are making an impact. So these happen to be absolute numbers of death. They're not rates per population, so I have a little bit of a bone to pick with whoever created these. However, these are countries in which the population has only expanded, so it's fine. It works out okay. But if we look at improvements in lower respiratory infections, significant decrease in deaths due to these, diarrheal diseases, significant decrease, malaria, significant decrease, HIV, AIDS, significant decrease. Like, these are huge success stories. So this is like, congratulations to all the public health workers and sanitation workers and city planners and everyone working on those social determinants of health, working on medical care. All types of things go into these astounding improvements that have been made all around the world. And in reality, it wasn't that long ago that the United States looked more like these other countries. So let me give you an example. So these are deaths due to infectious disease in the United States, starting in 1900 and going through the year 2000. And so it used to be that infectious diseases were about 800 per 100,000 population per year. So I like this because it's controlled for the population, which is very important because our population has exploded over the last century. But anyway, let's look at some of the major developments and the impact that it had. So formation of state health departments. This is public health coming on the scene in the beginning of the 1900s and saying, hey, I think there's things we can do to reduce burden of disease. And as you'll remember when we talked about the history of public health, early on it was mostly about infectious disease. And so we saw some improvements starting to happen. And then look, first use of chlorine to disinfect drinking water in the United States, right? So huge improvement. And then we had a really bad influenza pandemic in 1918, 1919. Lots of people died. It was horrible. It was also during World War I, which didn't help. But anyway, so we had a bump there. We eliminated plague from the United States. So that's pretty good. Then we discovered penicillin and antibiotics, and that really helped. And then the Salk vaccine this is the first vaccine for polio. And so all of these different things conspired to bring down the deaths due to infectious disease. And we were doing really, really well. And then you see we had the start of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And so deaths due to infectious disease started to go up again. They then came down as we got good at treating HIV. And then most recently, oh, they're up. Okay, so let me show you what this graph is. I'm reading my glasses. Okay, so this is data from the CDC looking at total deaths in the United States, in the entire country, per week. So that's what this is. I know it's hard to read the legend because the graphics are weird. So what we're looking at, each one of these little bars, let's see, let me get myself a laser pointer so you can see. Each one of these little, can you see that? I don't know. No, hold on. Okay, all right. Each one of these little bars is a week. And so what we are seeing, so down here, this is January of 2018, April 2018. January, yep, okay. Here's January 2019. There we go. All right. And then here is January 2020. Okay. So the first thing I want you to notice is this orange line. So this orange line here is the average number of expected weekly deaths in the country. Now this is based on our population rate and historical data. They use that to predict and model how many deaths we would expect to have. Now you might be like, why do they go up and come down and go up and come down and go up and come down? The reason is influenza. So actually most winters, past few years have been weird, but most winters we have influenza going throughout the country. And tens of thousands of people die from influenza every year. So we expect to see an increase in death rates every winter, and then it comes down, and then an increase in death rates in the winter, and then it comes down every single year. That's just how it goes. That's how it happens. So what you can see is that there's generally between 50 and 60,000 deaths per week on average in the United States, and this is from all causes. So regardless of cause of death, these are just total numbers of deaths from all causes. So here is April 2020, right? Boom, all of a sudden way more deaths than we would normally see. Started to taper off a little bit, then a hump, and then the next winter, huge. And then it came down again. This was our hot vax summer, and then it came up again, and then up. And then here we are now. So we're still seeing higher than average higher than expected death rates, and this is due to COVID. Okay, so these are termed excess deaths. These are deaths that we would not have expected to have, so something different is going on than what usually occurs. And almost all of these excess deaths were due to COVID. Some of them are due to overwhelmed health systems. So you might remember when the hospitals were completely swamped and overrun and there was no room for anybody. Even here locally, we had people that needed to be hospitalized. There were no beds. Even in Eau Claire, they opened up the parking garage at the Mayo Hospital for a while to try to put some people in there. Ambulances were having to drive people for hours to find a hospital that had room for them. And so some people died because of not being able to access healthcare because the healthcare system was overwhelmed. So if you remember talking about flattening the curve, we were trying to prevent overwhelm of the healthcare system. And that's also the reason, remember I mentioned when people say, well, what's it to you if I get vaccinated or not? I'm the one who would get really sick if I don't. It's like, well, the difference it makes to me is that if a whole bunch of people don't get vaccinated and get really sick all at the same time, then maybe the hospital isn't going to be there for me when I'm having a heart attack or get in a car accident, right? So yeah. The other causes of deaths, we did see an increase of deaths due to drug overdose and drug abuse. And that's multiple factors we think have probably contributed to that, including the fact that a lot of drug treatment programs shut down during the pandemic, right? Because people were doing everything completely remotely. People didn't have access to drug treatment centers and other social supports the way they had previously. And so that was pretty devastating. If we look at the COVID death rates specifically, so this is looking at COVID-19 deaths. Now, let me be clear. These deaths shown on this graph are deaths due to COVID, not people who died with COVID. These are people whose precipitating cause of death was the COVID infection itself, because we specify that on our death certificates. And so this is data compiled from death certificates. So remember our sources of data from a previous lecture, the 7 S's, and one is statistics, vital statistics like death certificates, birth certificates, those types of things. This is data from death certificates. The black line is total number of COVID deaths, right, by the month, right? You can see it's averaged out by the week. And then the different colors here are the ages. So this top line, these are the oldest people. So these are people in their 80s and upper 70s. And then, let's see, where's my age group? Down here. Right? So we can see that older people were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. They were more at risk of death. So this is that same graph I showed you before, looking at total deaths in the United States. And we see all these excess deaths far above what we would normally expect to see and still higher than normal deaths. So we have this new infectious disease on the scene and it is still causing significant harm. And then I thought it would be interesting to look at Wisconsin. So we can see this is just for the state of Wisconsin specifically down here. And you can see that although right when the pandemic hit, right, there were a huge spike in deaths overall for the country, but Wisconsin was relatively spared for a while. It didn't really arrive here until a little bit later. And then we did pretty well that hot back summer, and then we had a surge again. And then we are doing a little bit better than the country overall, but we still are having more deaths than we would normally expect at this time of year. So another way to look at this is the causes of death compared by cause. So remember when we talked about non-communicable diseases, we talked about how heart disease and stroke, and they break them out. I talked about them together kind of as atherosclerosis and cancer, right? Those are the big ones. So heart disease is this line here. This one is cancer, and then stroke is this purple one down here. So you can see heart disease far exceeds stroke. But what we can also see is COVID-19 deaths. So at several times during the pandemic, there were so many deaths due to COVID-19 that it was actually the #1 cause of death in the United States at that time, which is exceptionally unusual for us as a country who has made that epidemiological transition from having a high burden of infectious diseases to more non-communicable diseases, to have a large numbers of our population dying from a communicable or infectious disease is very unusual. But, a new global pandemic is very unusual. And so, in fact, if you just total up causes of death for the year, so that was looking at kind of by week, you can see that in 2020, COVID was the number 3 cause of death, as it was in 2021. And this is incomplete data, so again, I have a bone to pick with the people who made this graphic, because we really can't compare this to the other two, but we can compare the relative contributions of the different causes of death. So COVID-19, again, is a significant cause of death in this country. It looks like it will be for 2022 as well. So we've had a very weird time of things in high social development index countries, in that we've had a lot of deaths and disability adjusted life years and premature death from an infectious disease. If we look historically and worldwide, we will see that in most, in the world as a whole, again, this is just a different way of looking at what I showed you in the beginning with those big colored squares. Non-communicable diseases cause the most death, but communicable diseases, and here they also include nutritional diseases, are a significant contributor. But what I like about this one is you can see the change over time, right? So as places make that epidemiologic transition, let me change so you can actually see what I'm talking about. We can see that fewer and fewer people are dying of communicable diseases in the world, but we still have a lot of work to do. So this is a really important thing. It's also really important for us to keep in mind. We take a lot of this for granted in a country where communicable diseases do not, in general, most of the time, have a huge impact on our lives. But the situation is very different in different places in the world. So when we're thinking about communicable diseases in general, we want to think about who are the people who are most at risk. And so when we look at one population of people versus another, certainly we see that social developmental index, right? So countries that do not have the same levels of infrastructure, resources, sanitation systems, health services, those countries are going to have higher rates of communicable diseases just because of how these things are spread. Right? Within a population, within any population, then, assuming that everybody has kind of the same access to infrastructure and all those types of things, in general, the people who are at most risk of communicable diseases in terms of getting infected and or having severe outcomes are going to be the very young, so people who are not born yet, so fetuses, infants who are just born, and young children. Their immune systems are very immature and they have not been vaccinated yet, right? So we can't vaccinate you with everything right as soon as you are born, on the day you're born, in part because that would be mean, and in part because it just wouldn't work. Your immune system isn't developed enough, right? And it can take time to build immunity to these things. So the very young are usually at higher risk, and their organ systems aren't mature, and they're weird, right? Babies are weird. And then the very old. So as we age, our immune system gets less robust, as do many systems as we age. So no different than our brains and our hearts and our musculoskeletal systems. As we age, our immune system gets less robust. There are also people who, for a variety of reasons, might have compromised or less talented, shall we say, immune systems. Now, sometimes this is because they have an autoimmune disease or some type of medical condition. Sometimes it's due to a medication that they need to take to manage a health condition, or maybe they're a transplant recipient who needs to take medications to suppress their immune system so they don't reject their transplant. So there are lots of people in the United States who have compromised immune systems. Even people with diabetes, which is very common, their immune systems don't work as well as people without diabetes. So lots of people in this country have compromised immune systems for one reason or another. Pregnant people are at increased risk. So interestingly, when you're pregnant, we'll give a little graphic here to keep you paying attention. Your immune system gets suppressed so that you don't accidentally attack the baby. And things get weird with your physiology in a variety of ways that also make you more vulnerable to significant illness. People who have other medical problems. We saw this with COVID. So people who had histories of high blood pressure and heart disease and carrying excess weight were at significantly increased risk of severe illness from COVID. And those with poor social determinants of health. So people who are under-resourced, people who don't have access to care, people who are not well educated, people who live in environments that are less healthy than others, right? Those folks are at risk of but a higher likelihood of getting infected, and then if they get infected, they're at higher likelihood of having a severe outcome or getting severely ill. All right, so we tend to think of these groups, the very young, the very old, immune compromised, pregnant, people with other medical conditions and with poor social determinants of health as these kind of vulnerable populations, people we need to think about, right? We can't just say, oh, there's a pandemic going on, you people all stay at home and the rest of us will just carry on, right? These are parts of our communities, but we need to think about them. All right, the next general topic that we're going to talk about is routes of transmission. So how does an infectious disease get transmitted from one person to another? In other words, how do you catch it? Okay, and so I'm going to go through this on just one slide, but there's a lot in here, so hopefully you're going to get it, but I wanted to put it all in one place. So some infections are vector-borne, meaning that they are transmitted by insects that bite you. So one example would be Lyme disease, which is transmitted by tick bites. Another example would be malaria or West Nile or a bunch of other diseases like yellow fever and chikungunya that are transmitted by mosquitoes. So there are quite a lot of vector or insect-borne communicable diseases. They can be transmitted by animals. So you might be aware that bats are often carriers of rabies. And so the reason why we haven't been able to eliminate rabies from the world is that it's naturally present in many animals. We call them animal reservoirs. And so we're constantly kind of coming into contact with these animals and they can infect us. So it could be animals. It could be airborne, and lots of infections are airborne. I have a graphic. Oh, it's coming. The other is, so airborne means it spreads through the air, right? So either I cough or sneeze and a bunch of droplets, like these kind of very small, almost too small to see, particles spew out and they have germ in them that then you could inhale or you get in your eye or whatever it might be, then it gets into your body. Or fomites. So fomites is surfaces. So fomite is an inanimate object, right? Not a living thing that the germ can live on for a period of time. And then if you touch it and then maybe touch your mouth or rub your eye, you can infect yourself. So in the beginning of COVID, we weren't really sure if it was airborne transmission or fomite transmission. So here is the graphic that kind of shows you the examples here, right? So here is, airborne, but then, a big clump of snot, well, or not so big, lands on a surface, right? Fomites are contaminated surfaces. And then what if you touch that and then touch your eye or something? So in the very beginning of COVID, we were telling people to wash their hands a lot. We were using hand sanitizer. We were wiping down the desks. We were doing all those things because influenza, for example, is a respiratory infection, but it has significant fomite transmission. So it can live on contaminated surfaces for a while, and then you touch that and then touch your mouth or nose or eyes and you get infected. What we found later with COVID is that most transmission is airborne. It's airborne, it's aerosols and droplets. It's not through contaminated surfaces, right? I had friends who were working in COVID units who, when they came home in the beginning, they would shower and wash all their clothes and leave their dirty clothes. Like they would literally like strip down, leave all the clothes they wore at work in the garage, go right into the shower. They had these little UV disinfectant things for like their keys and other things that they had to touch. But then we learned that that wasn't going to be an issue, but it took us a while to be able to know that. All right. Sexually transmitted infections. So there's lots of different types of sexually transmitted infections. Some require different types of sexual activity to be transmitted from one person to another. So things like chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, syphilis, right? That's a great, you're getting up close and personal with somebody. That can be a really great way to spread a germ from one person to another. Then water and food. So, sometimes bags of salad lettuce are contaminated with E. coli or strawberries or hamburgers somewhere. Water, absolutely. So remember the case of John Snow and the cholera epidemic, where the contaminated well, the Broad Street pump, was the source of the cholera epidemic. So water and food can also be the routes of transmission. Fecal oral means that it's an infection that you kind of poop out, and then if some of those little bits of poop get into somebody else's mouth, then they get infected. So that is also kind of what was going on with the cholera epidemic in London, but then it got into the well and the pump. But this is why it's so important to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom, particularly if you are having a bowel movement. Now, urine is sterile. Poop is not, right? So fecal matter, stool, has lots of germs in it. Usually they're relatively harmless, but that's why you see all those signs, public health at work, in the restrooms at restaurants saying employees must wash their hands after using the bathroom. Fecal oral transmission is a problem for some things. And then there's bloodborne. So bloodborne transmission, those things in general sometimes are transmitted sexually as well, like HIV, but we see a lot of that with injection drug users. So people who are sharing needles, so who inject in their arm and then they give that needle to somebody else. So the blood gets kind of transmitted from one person to another. So the other way that bloodborne pathogens can be transmitted is through blood transfusions. And so if you've ever donated blood, they ask you a whole bunch of questions about whether you've traveled to certain regions, and then we now do all kinds of testing to make sure that that blood is safe. Finally, there's what's called vertical transmission, which is from the pregnant person to the fetus. So a woman who is infected with HIV, if she gets pregnant, she can pass the virus to her fetus in utero before it's even born. She can also end up passing it to the baby during labor and delivery and even during breastfeeding. So this kind of vertical transmission from parent to child can also occur. Okay. All right. Sorry, I had a text there. All right. So the next general principle is identifying the contributory causes. So really what we're doing here in the case of a communicable disease is trying to identify the germ. So back in John Snow's day, he was just able to identify the Broad Street pump. They had no idea that there was a bacterium called Vibrio cholera, right? They didn't know, but now we can usually identify the germ. And the way we're going to do that is by using what are called Koch's postulates, after the scientist Koch who came up with this. And so what we're looking for are the potential germs that could be causing a certain disease. Now, our potential cast of characters here, there are different types of germs. So there can be bacteria, there can be viruses, there can be parasites, and there can be prions. So COVID is a virus, for example. Strep that causes strep throat is a bacteria. The germ that causes mono, if you've ever had mono, that's a virus. Let's see, parasites. Scabies is a parasite, if you've ever had scabies. Fleas. Okay, so what are these postulates? This is kind of a modern take on them. So what are the criteria that you have to fulfill in order to say this germ is causing this disease? The first is you need to have this epidemiologic association, really a group association between the presence of the pathogen, the germ, and presence of the disease. So if you find that, well, most of the people who are having the disease also have the germ, right, then that's a pretty good indicator, but it's not enough by itself. You also have to be able to find it, so not just in those populations or groups, but in actual individuals with the disease, right? So now taking it down to that individual level. And then, oh yeah, caution here. So the word isolate gets used two different ways in public health. It's super annoying. So in this context, isolation means you can find the germ in that person. You can detect the germ in that person. In other contexts in public health, to isolate somebody means to, like, if somebody's infected with COVID, you keep them away from other people and you isolate them. So it's very confusing. I apologize. They didn't ask me when they came up with these terminology. Okay. And then the third is you have to demonstrate that you can transmit the disease by giving the germ. So usually we're not going to do this in people. In the olden days, they did. They were like, I think this causes smallpox. Let me give some to you and see what happens, right? Thankfully, we don't do that anymore. For the most part, we use either animals, or now we'll use cell culture. So just cells that are growing in a petri dish, and we'll see, well, if I infect them, do they start behaving like the cells of somebody with this disease? So that's Koch's postulates, or how we establish contributory cause or identify the germ that's responsible for the disease. The next thing we want to do is we want to get a sense of a potential impact. How bad can this be, right? How bad can these different infections, these different communicable diseases be? The potential impact, or how bad it's going to be, is going to depend on two main factors. One is, how serious is the illness itself? Right? So if you get infected, what is the case fatality rate? How many people that get infected with this die? What is the hospitalization rate? How many people don't die, but they get really sick and they're in the hospital? Or disability, right? How many people maybe don't die and maybe can get put in the hospital, but have long-term consequences or suffering or decreased function because of it? So in the example of COVID, right, we have people with long COVID now who are not in as good health as they were before. And then are there any other long-term complications? So this is less frequent. In the olden days when scarlet fever was an issue, if you had scarlet fever as a child, it increased your risk for some problems with your heart valves later on in life. There can be these weird things that happen. So that's for how serious the individual illness is, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. But next I want to talk about how contagious is it, because that's going to tell you how many people are going to get it. So when we're thinking about the impact on a population as a whole, we don't just care about how severe the disease is. We want to know how many people are going to get it, because that's going to determine the size of the impact on our population as a whole. So the way we talk about how contagious a certain infection is with the R naught. Now you notice here, contagious as a word is the same thing as infectious, is the same thing as transmissible, is the same thing as communicable. So we have like 4 different words that mean the same thing, which means you can transmit it from one person to another. It's catching, it's contagious, okay? Again, I apologize. So R naught, R with a little 0 underneath it, is the number of people on average that get infected by one infected person. So on average, for example, a person with measles, right? So here's measles. On average, they infect between 10 and 18 other people, right? So you have one person gets measles, on average, they're going to infect 10 to 18 other people. And then those 10 to 18 other people are going to themselves infect 10 to 18 other people, right? That's really, really, really contagious. Okay, whooping cough, as you can see, which is pertussis, is highly contagious. Chickenpox is super contagious. When I used to do pediatrics, if a parent was bringing in a kid that they thought had chickenpox, we would say, okay, don't bring them into the office. I will come out to the car and I will examine the kid in the car, because I don't want you bringing a potentially infectious or contagious kid with chickenpox into my clinic. HIV, if it's untreated, can have usually around an R naught of about 5 in people who are untreated. Then we see diseases that you've probably never heard about because you've been vaccinated. So diphtheria, rubella, polio, smallpox, mumps. And then here's flu, right? So not the biggest. And then here's Ebola here, right? So different germs are more or less contagious. And how contagious, or what the R naught is going to show you how it can spread. So for example, If a condition has an R0 of 2, that means on average, each person is going to infect 2 people. So you can see here, we start with 1 infected person, and then 2 people get infected by them, and then each of those infects 2 people, so now we have 4, and then each of those infects 2 people, so now we have 16? Yes, 16, right? And it goes on and on and on, right? So it will go 8, and then it would go 16, and it goes on and on. So let's look at the difference, though, if we dial that R0 up to 5, right? Let's look at how that goes. Bam! Right? Huge. So we go from 1 to 5 to 25 to 125. It's ridiculous how quickly something can spread if it has a really high R0. So this is a graphical representation. Let me give you a different type of representation of the same data. So here is an example of, let's see if it takes a week to spread for a disease with an R0 of 2. You can see week 1, we have 1 person, week 2, we have 2, then we have 4, then we have 8, then we have 16, and so on, so that by week 8, you would have 120 people more infected with the condition. However, if we compare that to an R0 of 5, look at the difference, okay? So the y-axis is the same here, but the weeks only go to week 4. And look at how much the R0 of 5 has outpaced the disease with the R0 of 2. And the disease with the R0 of 2 was spreading really, really fast. Okay, so R0 is a really important number when we're talking about communicable or infectious diseases. So what impacts the R0? Like what determines whether something is really contagious or not? Part of it is the pathogen itself, the characteristics of the germ, the virus, the bacteria. Some germs are just really, really contagious. They're really good at turning your body into little germ factories that can then infect lots of other people. So some of it is just inherent in the type of infection it is itself. But mitigation measures that we do or do not employ can make a huge difference on the R0. So things like social distancing and masks reduce the ability of COVID to infect other people. Chlorinating our water supply reduces the ability of cholera to infect other people. So R0 is not just due to the germ itself, it's also due to the things that we do or do not do to try to control the germ, as well as our immunity to the germ. So if I have really good immunity against something, then you can't infect me, right? And so you get immunity through both natural infection, right? So having gotten infected and then your immune system learns to fight it off, and through vaccination. Both are good ways to develop immunity. In general, vaccination is a much, much safer way, a much lower risk of severe illness for most things. But what's interesting is that although your individual vaccination status or immunity status has a high impact on your disease outcome as an individual, in order to have an impact at the population level, you need to have really, really high immunity. You need to have a lot of people immune. It also ideally needs to be what's called sterilizing immunity in order to make it so that people then can't transmit the germ to other people. There's various different levels of immunity, and this sterilizing or neutralizing immunity is sometimes easy to get and sometimes not easy to get depending on the germ. And so, spoiler alert, for COVID, it's very difficult to get sterilizing immunity that lasts for any significant length of time, which is part of why what has happened has happened. Okay. So when we're thinking about how quickly something can spread then, so say I'm the public health officer for Dunn County, thank goodness I'm not, right? But say, and I want to know, okay, well, how quickly could this thing blow up and overwhelm our hospitals, for example? I want to know not only the R0, but also what's my lag time. And so my lag time is called the latent period. So what happens is if I get infected with COVID, a period of time goes by before I can then give that COVID to somebody else. The longer that lag time or latent period is, then the more slowly it's going to spread through the population because it takes people longer to become contagious, right? So let me just kind of show you here. Anytime you get infected, right? So this line here is when you get infected. You don't start having symptoms until here, right? That's what this arch is, oh, I feel sick, I feel yucky. right? In COVID and many other things, you start becoming contagious before your symptoms start, okay? Which is tricky. Not all diseases do that. COVID does, right? So this latent period in COVID is shorter, and for many diseases is shorter than the time to disease or symptom onset. So let's take a look specifically at COVID. All right. So for the original virus, the R0 was 2.5, which is pretty high, actually, for an infectious disease. Not anything like measles, but on the higher side, higher than influenza for sure. And the latent period was about 4 days. So let me show you what that looks like. So here's where you get infected, right here. Here's the latent period. And then starting here, you are infectious or contagious to others, right? So you're infectious starting from about 2 days before your symptoms started, right? Here's kind of symptom onset here. And then you stay contagious, really contagious for about 5 days, and then somewhat contagious out to day 10 for the most part. Now, these are averages. It varies from person to person. And not only does it vary from person to person, these are just averages, but COVID then went and mutated, right? So as things do, so we started with the original virus, and then we had the alpha variant, and then we had the beta variant and the gamma, and then the delta. And the delta variant, interesting, was more contagious than the original. So its R0 was somewhere around 3 to 6.5. And then most recently, Omicron came on the scene, and its R0, right, the summer of 2022, and then its R0 was somewhere around 5 to 10. It's really hard to know because at this point, lots of people aren't testing anymore, and we don't have good data, and we think the latent period is as short as 2 to 3 days. So higher R0, shorter latent period, so really rapid transmission. So let me show you what we're looking at here. I'm sorry, my video thing is in the way. So we're looking at daily new confirmed cases per million people. So it's adjusted per population for the United Kingdom, United States, and European Union, because they have a lot of things in common. They're very similar. So we're looking, it starts way back in 2020, and then this goes just till January of 2022, this particular one, just because I liked cutting it off right there. This is the original strain of the virus, right? And then things got a little bit better. And then we had a little blip from the alpha variant. And then we had Delta wave, and that was pretty significant. And then, oh my Lord, look at Omicron. Look at how quickly it spread and how many people it infected, right? So just like huge, because the latent period was shorter and its R0 was higher. So this thing just took off like crazy. So this is looking at that region in 2 different countries. Same thing happened here in Wisconsin, just went right up really high as soon as we hit Omicron. So again, there's the original Alpha, Delta, and then we got Omicron right on top of our Delta wave here in Wisconsin. Okay, so that is how quickly it's going to spread through the population. What's the R0 and what is the latent period? So that was how contagious it is and how quickly is it going to spread. Now what's going to determine the severity of the illness, right? So part of it is the pathogen itself, right? The germ itself, just like with R0, same thing for the severity. Some germs are going to kill you, like, Ebola usually does. Rabies has a really high fatality rate. Part is the dose to which you're exposed. So sometimes if somebody just coughed a whole big cloud of COVID into your face, you would get sicker than if you just got a little whiff of it. So the dose to which you're exposed can make a difference. And then there are factors unique to you. So we talked about this before, right? What are our vulnerable populations? So age, very young, very old. Are you immune compromised? Are you pregnant? Do you have other medical conditions that increase your risk? And do you have immunity from vaccination or previous infection or both, right? So with Omicron, when we're thinking about what's the potential impact of the illness, right? So it was very contagious and it spread really rapidly, but it tended to cause less severe disease. In part, we think because of changes in the virus itself and the pathogen itself, Also, to a large extent, because of immunity in the population from both previous infection and vaccination. But when we look at the potential impact, even though it's less severe, we can see, so now we're going to look at data for Wisconsin, that the number of people who got hospitalized from the Omicron surge was just about as high as the number of people who got hospitalized from our first winter surge. So our second winter with COVID was just as bad as our first winter, despite the virus, the variant, being less severe in and of itself. And the reason is because it was so much more contagious. So many more people were getting it in such a quick period of time that it caused a lot of hospitalizations. Even though per case it was less severe, there were just so many more cases. So it still had just as big of an impact, because even though it was less severe, it was more contagious. So if we look at what's happening currently, so this goes up right till January 2023, we can see these are hospitalizations over here. We are not back down to kind of normal. We're not anywhere close to that. We're not up here, which is great because that's where we've been other winters, and hopefully we won't get there, right? But we're still having significant impact from this disease. So again, when we're looking at potential impact, how serious the disease is, what's the case fatality rate, what proportion of people get hospitalized, have long-term complications, and then how contagious it is, how rapidly and to what extent it can spread through the population. So this chart is looking at R0 on the bottom, so average number of people infected by each sick person, that's the R0. So down here, R0 of 1. So seasonal flu, on average, most people transmit it to like 1.2 people. So it doesn't tend to spread very quickly, but it still gets there, right? Here's chickenpox, I told you, really contagious. Here's measles. And on the y-axis, what we're looking at, and this is a log scale, so it's kind of weird, but it's the case fatality rate, right? So Ebola is up here, right? Smallpox is up here, right? So what we see is things that are kind of, let's see, I'm going to use a different color. Things that are kind of over here, right, don't tend to cause a significant impact, right? And then once we get out here, we start to see more of an impact. And then the farther and farther we get out, we see more of an impact on the population, either because it's infecting a lot more people, and therefore, even though severe disease isn't common, there's enough of it that we're still seeing a lot, or because it's very deadly. This is the same type of chart looking at R0 and case fatality rate that just includes a whole bunch of other types of infectious diseases, which I think is interesting to look at. It's by this guy, David McCandless, who wrote a book, Information is Beautiful. It's a really cool book if you're as nerdy as I am and you want to check it out. But what I like about this too is that he used different colors to designate the route of transmission. So whether it's airborne, whether it's by animal or insect bites, body fluids, fecal, oral, food, sexual contact, or surfaces. So that's kind of cool. I like it. But the other thing that you can see out here, mumps, whooping cough, measles, highly contagious, right? And so that's why we vaccinated people against it, because now we don't see those diseases anymore, which is pretty amazing. Well, not much. We'll get to that. All right, so for general concepts, we've now talked about burden, routes of transmission, how we identify contributory cause, Koch's postulates, and then potential impact. So that depends on the transmissibility, how contagious it is, what's its R0, and how quickly can it spread through the population, what's that latent period, and then the severity of the disease that it caused. So if you do get infected, what's the likelihood that you're going to get very sick or die? All right, so that was a lot. So we're going to take a break, and then in part 2, we're going to talk about tools and strategy.